The restaurant was the kind of place that made Emily Carter feel like she was wearing the wrong skin. Candlelight white tablecloths, a wine list she didn't recognize. She had smiled through the first 10 minutes of the date, the kind of smile she practiced in elevator mirrors before walking into boardrooms. Then Derek Sloan leaned back in his chair, looked her over the way someone inspects a flawed product, and said, "Women like her should probably be grateful anyone showed up at all." Emily stood, and from somewhere behind her, a voice cut through the room like a blade. Cold. Familiar. Unmistakably Ryan Walker. Ryan Walker did not do uncertainty. In 11 years of running Walker Global, he had made decisions that moved markets' restructured divisions overnight, and walked away from deals that lesser men spent months agonizing over. He was the kind of man who entered a room and immediately recalibrated its center of gravity without trying. 48 floors above Manhattan, behind floor-to-ceiling glass that turned the city into something manageable, he had built a version of himself that did not flinch. That version had been working just fine. Until a Tuesday afternoon when Emily Carter asked to leave at 4:30. She had knocked on his open door the way she always did, 2 quick raps, then waited. She never walked in uninvited. In 4 years of working together, she had never once overstepped that line, and Ryan had stopped noticing the courtesy the way you stop noticing a well-oiled door hinge. It works. You move on. But that afternoon, he noticed, because what came out of her mouth next was something he had not prepared for. She needed to leave early. A personal appointment. She would have the Brennan contracts on his desk before she left, and the Thursday briefing materials were already prepped in the shared drive. Her voice was the same voice she used when she told him his 2 o'clock had been moved, or that the Singapore team had pushed back on the revised terms, measured efficient, carrying no trace of apology. She was not asking for his approval. She was informing him. Ryan said fine. He turned back to his monitor. And then she was gone, and the office felt like a room where someone had quietly turned down the thermostat by 3 degrees. He told himself it was nothing. He had work. He had a call with the Frankfurt office at 5 and a stack of acquisition briefs that needed his signature before end of day. He pulled up the Brennan file, found it exactly where she said it would be, every clause flagged, every discrepancy noted in the margin, with a clean, concise explanation. Emily's work always looked like this invisible effort made to seem effortless. Ryan had long ago stopped thanking her for it, the way you stop thanking air for being breathable. She was simply there. She had always simply been there. He initialed the 3rd page of the Brennan file and realized he had been reading the same clause for 4 minutes without absorbing a single word of it. He signed the Brennan contracts. He took the Frankfurt call. He answered 3 emails that should have been answered 2 days ago. And somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd email, he found himself thinking about the way she had said personal appointment, the faint hesitation before the word personal, so brief he almost hadn't caught it. Emily Carter did not hesitate. She was the most precise communicator he had ever worked with, the kind of person who chose words the way an engineer chose load-bearing materials deliberately, with full awareness of what each one was carrying. That fraction of a second meant something, and Ryan could not explain why it bothered him that he didn't know what. He was not a man who pried into the lives of his employees. He maintained a deliberate professional distance from everyone in the building, Emily included. That distance had served him well since his marriage ended 6 years ago. Clean lines, no complications. No one inside the perimeter who could make demands he wasn't equipped to meet. He had tried the other version once. He knew what it looked like when it came apart. The arrangement he had now was efficient. It suited him. He was certain it suited her too. It took him 20 minutes and 1 poorly timed conversation with his head of operations to find out where she was going. He hadn't asked directly. He had mentioned casually that Emily had left early and seemed distracted. His head of operations, a well-meaning woman named Sandra, who knew everything that happened on the 48th floor before it happened anywhere else, filled in the rest with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to share the information. A date, a setup by one of Emily's friends, a restaurant in Midtown, the Italian place on 53rd, that had a 3-week wait list. Sandra had said it like it was good news. Ryan had nodded like he agreed. Ryan's first response was a calm, rational thought. Good for her. His second response arrived before the first had finished forming, and it was neither calm nor rational. It was a tightness across the chest that he immediately classified as work stress and moved on from. He had a dinner meeting he needed to confirm. He pulled up his calendar. The dinner meeting was on Wednesday. Tonight was Tuesday. He stared at that for longer than was reasonable. He told himself he was going to the same neighborhood for a different reason. This was not untrue. There was a client he had been meaning to reach out to who kept an office 3 blocks from that restaurant, and showing up unannounced with a dinner invitation was exactly the kind of move that built the sort of relationships contracts couldn't formalize. He believed this reasoning completely. He believed it in the car, and he believed it walking through the cold evening air on 53rd Street, and he believed it right up until he stepped inside the restaurant and immediately scanned the room for Emily Carter instead of his client. He spotted her at a corner table near the window. She was wearing a dark green dress he had never seen before, and her hair was down, which it never was at the office. She looked different. Not unrecognizable, he would have recognized her anywhere, but different in the way that a familiar place looks different when you see it. At a time of day you've never been there before. Something about seeing her outside the building, outside the fluorescent competence of the office, made him understand that he had been looking at a partial version of her for 4 years. She had a life that existed entirely outside the 48th floor, and he had never once thought to wonder what it looked like. He registered all of this in approximately 2 seconds, and then made himself look at the man sitting across from her. The man was the kind of handsome that announces itself before the conversation starts. Tailored jacket, easy posture, the particular brand of confidence that comes from a lifetime of being told, you belong in any room you enter. He was talking. Emily was listening with that specific quality of attention. She had still focused, giving whoever she was looking at the impression that they were the only person worth listening to in a crowded space. Ryan had benefited from that attention every working day for 4 years. Watching someone else receive it produced a sensation he refused to name. He moved toward the bar instead of examining it too closely. He ordered something he didn't intend to drink and positioned himself where he could see the table without being seen. This was, he understood, distantly not normal behavior. He was a CEO who had restructured a $3 billion company over a single weekend. He did not lurk at restaurant bars watching his assistant on dates, and yet he did not move. He told himself he would leave in 5 minutes. He told himself that twice. The drink sat untouched in front of him, and he watched Emily smile at something the man said, a real smile this time, not the elevator mirror kind, and he felt the tightness across his chest again, and still refused to name it. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. Ryan would later be unable to account for how such a specific window of time could rearrange the floor plan of everything he thought he knew about himself. The man Derek Ryan would learn his name later, leaned back and said something that made Emily's expression shift. Not dramatically. Emily never did anything dramatically. But Ryan had spent 4 years reading micro-expressions across conference tables, and he caught it. The slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her chin lifted by a fraction, the smile that stayed in place because she was too disciplined to let it fall. She was absorbing something that hurt, the kind of hurt that a person who has had a lot of practice absorbing does quietly without spectacle, in a way that makes it invisible to everyone, except someone who has been watching them closely enough for long enough. Derek said it louder the second time, loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over. Ryan caught enough of it to fill in the rest. Something about her weight. Something about how she ought to appreciate the gesture of someone agreeing to meet her. The words were dressed up in the language of casual observation, which made them worse, the kind of cruelty that comes with built-in deniability that smiles while it cuts. Emily's hand moved to her water glass, wrapped around it, held it. Ryan watched her pull in a breath and begin to stand. She was going to leave with her chin up and her coat folded over her arm and her dignity completely intact, and Derek Sloan was going to sit at that table and feel like he'd won something. Ryan was already moving before he made the decision to move. Later, he would not remember crossing the room. He would only remember arriving at the table the way Derek looked up at him, with the automatic deference people produce when they're confronted with a certain type of presence, and the way Emily went very still when she saw who it was. Not relieved, not grateful. Still. Ryan looked at Derek with the precise, unhurried attention he reserved for people who had just made a serious error in a negotiation. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said quietly, and without theatrics, that Derek had spent the last 4 minutes making himself very easy to describe to the right people in this city, and that the restaurant they were currently sitting in was owned by a man who owed Ryan a favor, which meant Derek might want to consider finishing his wine at a different establishment. He left no room for a response. Derek processed the situation, the stillness in Ryan's voice, the absence of bluster, the sense of something immovable behind the words, and made the calculation that most people made in those moments. He picked up his jacket. He left. The table was quiet. Around them, the restaurant hummed back to its regular frequency silverware and low voices, and someone laughing at the bar. Emily was still standing. She looked at Ryan with an expression he had never seen on her before, and in 4 years he had seen her face through acquisitions and crises and 20-hour days, and the kind of pressure that strips most people of their composure entirely. This expression was different. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was something closer to the look of a person who has been walked in on, who has been seen in a moment they had already decided to handle alone. She told him she hadn't asked for that. Her voice was steady, which somehow made it worse. She said she was handling it. Ryan said he could see that, which was not the right thing to say, and he knew it the moment it left his mouth. Emily picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She said she'd see him in the morning. She walked out of the restaurant without looking back, and Ryan stood at the empty table in the middle of a room full of strangers and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a man who had made a mistake he didn't know how to classify. He paid for her untouched meal on his way out. He didn't know why he did it. It was not a grand gesture. She would never know he had done it. He walked back out into the cold, and the city was exactly as loud and indifferent as it always was, and Ryan Walker stood on the sidewalk on 53rd Street and understood with the quiet precision of a man who spent his life reading situations correctly that something had just shifted in a direction he was not prepared for. He had gone to that restaurant telling himself he was protecting an asset. Standing on that sidewalk, he could no longer make that argument hold. Emily was at her desk by 8 the next morning. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that she did not bring him coffee. In 4 years, Emily had never once made a point of bringing Ryan coffee. It was not in her job description, and she had never treated it as a gesture of warmth. It was simply something she did because she was always there first, and she knew how he took it, and it saved them both 30 seconds at the start of a meeting. The absence of it that Wednesday morning was not dramatic. It was precise. Ryan noticed it the way you notice when a clock that has always ticked suddenly doesn't. He gave her until 9 before walking to her office. He knocked. She said, "Come in," without looking up from her screen, which was also not unusual, except that she always looked up. He stood in the doorway for a moment, before sitting in the chair across from her desk, the chair typically reserved for people who needed things from Emily, which he supposed was accurate. He told her he wanted to explain about the night before. Emily said there was nothing to explain, her eyes still on the screen. Ryan said he disagreed. She set down her pen, then slowly, and looked at him with the expression of someone who has already decided how a conversation is going to end. She told him clearly and without heat that she was a grown woman who had been managing her own life for 31 years without his intervention. She said she understood he meant well. She said meaning well and being welcome were two different things. Ryan started to say that he hadn't planned to be there, that the evening had not gone the way he intended, and she stopped him by asking a single question: how did he know where she was? The question landed in the room and sat there. Ryan could not answer it with anything that didn't sound like what it was. He said Sandra had mentioned it. Emily's expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. It meant she had already considered this possibility and had not been surprised by it. That told him something about how long she had been navigating a version of invisible. She said she'd make sure to keep her personal schedule out of office conversations in the future. Then she picked up her pen and looked back at her screen. The meeting was over. Ryan had been dismissed from rooms by more powerful people than he could count, but he had never been dismissed quite like that. Not with coldness, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who has learned not to expect better. He walked back to his office and sat behind his desk and stared at the Frankfurt briefing he had already read 3 times. He read it a 4th time and retained nothing. The next 2 weeks moved in the way of weeks where something has shifted, but no one has named it yet. Emily continued to do her job with the same flawless efficiency she always had. The briefings were prepared. The contracts were flagged. The calls were managed. She attended every meeting, contributed exactly when needed, and maintained the kind of professional composure that made Ryan feel irrationally like he was the one who had done something unforgivable. The coffee reappeared on the 3rd day left on the corner of his desk before he arrived, which he understood was not a reconciliation, so much as a return to function. She wasn't freezing him out. She was simply not letting him in. There was a difference, and Ryan felt it in every interaction that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not 1 second more. He started paying attention in a way he hadn't before, or more accurately, he started noticing what his attention had been doing all along without his permission. The way Emily spoke in strategy meetings, laying out problems and solutions in a sequence so logical that the rest of the room often went quiet, not because they were unimpressed, but because she had already arrived at the conclusion they were still working toward. The way she moved through a room during a crisis, unhurried, precise. The kind of calm that isn't the absence of pressure, but the result of having processed it faster than everyone else. He had watched that quality operate in his favor for 4 years, and never once stopped to consider what it meant that he had never given it a name, never given it a title, never given it anything except more work, which she had always accepted, because that was the arrangement, and she had never asked for it to be otherwise. The Hargrove account nearly collapsed in the 3rd week of the month. A miscommunication between 2 department heads had left the proposal in a state that should have taken 2 weeks to repair. Emily spent 3 nights restructuring it, alone rebuilt the financial projections from the ground up, and presented the revised package to the Hargrove team on a Friday morning, so cleanly that they signed without requesting a single revision. Ryan had been in the room for that presentation. He had watched Emily walk the Hargrove partners through the numbers with the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself. It simply occupies the space and waits for the room to catch up. The Hargrove team had caught up quickly. Ryan had accepted the result, the way he always accepted Emily's results as a given, as background, as the reliable ground beneath his feet that he had long since stopped noticing because it had never once failed to hold. He understood now that he had been doing that for 4 years, accepting the product and never once looking at the cost. The realization did not make him feel good about himself. He sat with it, the way he sat with bad quarterly numbers directly without excuses, trying to understand the actual shape of the problem. And the more clearly he saw it, the more another thing became clear to him too, something that had nothing to do with performance reviews or professional appreciation. He did not want Emily Carter to leave that building. Not for another job, not for a dinner date, not for any reason that put distance between them. He wanted her in the office at 8 in the morning. He wanted to hear her voice in the hallway before she appeared in his doorway. He wanted specifically and uncomplicatedly her, and the only thing more inconvenient than admitting that to himself was the certainty that she would not believe him if he said it out loud. He did not say it out loud. He went to work. He managed the thing quietly, the way he managed most things that didn't have an immediate solution, which is to say, he filed it in a part of his mind, where it sat and compounded interest. He told himself there would be a right moment. He told himself the distance between them would close naturally once she stopped being angry. He told himself several things that a more self-aware man might have recognized as delay, and a braver one might have recognized as fear. The call from Marcus Holt's office came on a Thursday. Sandra flagged it with the particular look she wore when information required handling delicately, a look Ryan had learned to recognize and dislike in equal measure. Pinnacle Strategies, a competing firm that had been circling Walker Global's client base for the better part of 18 months, had approached Emily directly. Marcus Holt, Pinnacle's head of strategy, had reached out through a mutual contact with an offer for a senior executive position, VP of Strategic Operations, a title that did not exist at Walker Global in Emily's name, and a compensation package that Sandra, lowering her voice, estimated was significantly above what Emily was currently earning. The meeting had already taken place. Off-site, last Tuesday during Emily's lunch break, Ryan sat with that information for longer than he'd sat with anything in recent memory. He did not call Emily into his office. He did not ask Sandra how she'd found out, because the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that Marcus Holt had looked at Emily Carter's work, at the strategies she had drafted, the accounts she had saved, the deals she had quietly shaped from the margins, and had seen exactly what was there. What mattered was that Ryan had seen it too for years, and had never once formalized it. Had never once handed her a title that matched the actual weight of what she carried. Had never made her position at Walker Global something she could point to from the outside and say, "This is what I built." He thought about that for a long time after Sandra left his office. He thought about Emily sitting across from Marcus Holt at a lunch table somewhere in the city, listening to a man describe her own value back to her in numbers and job titles, the way she had sat across from Derek Sloan a few weeks earlier, except this time, the person on the other side of the table wasn't diminishing her. He was recognizing her. And Ryan understood, with the particular clarity that arrives too late and cannot be argued with, that he had allowed someone else to do the thing he should have done years ago. That thought sat in him like something with edges. He called a meeting with his legal team that afternoon to discuss the terms of an executive partnership restructure. He said it was preliminary. He did not mention Emily by name. He was not ready to say out loud what he was constructing, because the moment he said it, it would be about more than strategy. And Ryan Walker was a man who had spent 6 years becoming very good at not letting things be about more than strategy. Emily, for her part, said nothing about Pinnacle. She continued working. She sat in the Thursday briefing and walked the room through a revised competitive analysis for the Northeast region that was by any objective measure the clearest articulation of Walker Global's market positioning Ryan had heard in 2 years. He watched her at the head of that table and thought about Marcus Holt making her an offer that reflected what she was actually worth. He thought about what it meant that someone else had done that math before he had. He thought about all the mornings the coffee had appeared on the corner of his desk, and he had picked it up without looking at who left it, the way you reach for a light switch in the dark without thinking about the hand that installed it. The Thursday briefing ended. People filed out. Emily gathered her materials with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Ryan said her name as she reached the door. She turned. He told her the Hargrove result was exceptional work. Emily looked at him steadily for a moment, then said, "Thank you." She appreciated that and left. The door swung quietly shut behind her. Ryan stayed in the empty conference room for a while, looking at the chair where she'd been sitting, thinking about the gap between what he'd just said and what he had meant to say, and how that gap had been accumulating quietly for 4 years. He went home that evening and sat in the too-clean living room of an apartment that functioned perfectly and felt nothing like a place where a person lived. And he thought about the fact that the most alive he had felt in years was standing at the bar of a restaurant on 53rd Street, watching Emily Carter listen to someone who didn't deserve her attention. And then, later on the sidewalk, understanding he'd mishandled it. And then, every morning after that, when the coffee appeared on the corner of his desk, and the first sound of the day was the efficient click of her heels in the hallway. He thought about all of that for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his lawyer back. He told him to move the partnership restructure from preliminary to active. He told him to have the framework ready by end of week. It was not a declaration. It was not even close to everything that needed to be said. But Ryan Walker had spent 11 years building things by starting with the structure and working outward, and this was what he knew how to do begin. The rest, the part that terrified him, the part that had nothing to do with titles or compensation packages or legal frameworks, that part was still waiting. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a door in a room you have been pretending isn't there. He would have to open it eventually. He just didn't know yet what it would cost him when he did. The resignation letter was on his desk on a Monday morning. Not emailed. Printed, folded once, placed in the center of his desk where the coffee usually sat. Ryan found it before he found anything else. He read it once, standing still in his coat. Then he sat down and read it again. It was 4 sentences. Emily's writing was always economical. She didn't use 3 words where 1 would do, and the letter was no different. She thanked him for 4 years. She cited personal and professional reasons. She gave 2 weeks' notice and offered to ensure a thorough transition. She signed it with her full name, Emily R. Carter, which she never did on internal documents. The formality of it hit him somewhere specific. He folded it back along its original crease and set it down, and then picked it up and read it a 3rd time, which did not change anything about what it said. He stood up and walked to her office. The door was open. She was already at her desk, already working as if the letter had been filed and the matter was settled, and the next item on her list was the Morrison account review. Ryan stood in the doorway the way he had once before, except this time he didn't sit down immediately. He looked at her for a moment at the desk covered in organized files, the second monitor angled precisely, the single cup of coffee she had made only for herself that morning, and then he sat. He asked if they could talk. Emily said of course, and gestured to the chair across from her desk with the same professional courtesy she extended to everyone. That was the thing that undid him slightly, the everyone. He had become everyone. He asked her if this was about Pinnacle. Emily's expression shifted by a fraction, just enough to tell him she'd known he knew. She said Pinnacle had nothing to do with it. He said he didn't believe that. And she said, with a steadiness that cost her something he could see but couldn't reach, that Pinnacle had made her an offer that reflected what her work was actually worth, and the reason she was leaving wasn't because of that offer. It was because accepting it was the first time in 4 years she'd been given a reason to consider what her work was worth at all. The room held that sentence. Ryan didn't move. He told her he had been working on a restructure, that he had already spoken to legal, that there was a framework in progress that would formalize her role as executive partner. Emily listened to all of this with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes on him, and when he finished, she asked him quietly when he had started that process. He said 2 weeks ago. She nodded once the way she nodded when she received information she had already anticipated. She said she appreciated that, and that she meant it, and that it didn't change her decision. Ryan asked why, and Emily, who had spent 4 years being precise and controlled and professionally immaculate, finally said the thing she had been carrying for longer than she could accurately measure. She told him she was tired of being invisible. She said it without anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. She said that she understood. Her job understood the boundaries, understood that what she contributed had always been structural rather than visible, and that she had made her peace with that, or thought she had, until a man in a restaurant told her she should be grateful anyone had shown up. And the worst part wasn't that he'd said it. The worst part was the 3 seconds before Ryan appeared at that table, when she'd been standing there, absorbing it completely, alone, and she had thought, this is what I am. A woman who does extraordinary work in rooms where no one puts her name on it, and sits across from men who look at her and calculate what she's worth based on how she fills a dress. She said she was done being that. She said she needed to go somewhere that saw her clearly before she had to stage a crisis to prove she existed. She said all of this in the same measured voice she used for everything, which meant she had been rehearsing it for a long time, and the fact that she had needed to rehearse it told him more than the words themselves did. Ryan sat with what she'd said for a long moment. Then he asked her directly what she meant when she said the worst part was the 3 seconds before he appeared. Emily looked at him. She said she thought he understood what she meant. He said he needed to hear her say it. She looked away then for the first time in the conversation toward the window and the gray morning light coming through it. She said she meant that it would have been easier if she didn't care whose table she was sitting at when she finally felt seen. Ryan didn't say anything. He let that sentence exist in the room without rushing to cover it with words, which was not something he was practiced at, but which felt in that moment like the only honest response available to him. He left her office. He did not ask her to reconsider. He walked back to his own office, closed the door, and stood at the window that looked out over 48 floors of Manhattan and thought about the shape of what had just happened. Emily had not told him she was in love with him. She had told him something more difficult than that. She had told him she had been disappearing quietly and incrementally in the space beside him, and that she had allowed it because caring about him had made the arrangement feel like enough. And it hadn't been enough. It had been a slow erosion dressed up as professionalism and kept in place by the fact that he had never once looked directly at it. He thought about the version of himself that had stood at a restaurant bar on 53rd Street and told himself he was there for a client meeting. He thought about how long he had been doing that, constructing reasonable explanations for unreasonable feelings, maintaining the architecture of distance, because the alternative required him to be a different kind of man than the one he had carefully rebuilt after his marriage ended. That version had been functional. It had been safe. It had also, he now understood, been slowly costing Emily Carter something she should never have been asked to pay. She had been carrying the weight of being essential to someone who had never once told her so, and she had done it without complaint, and she had done it while also carrying the quieter, more private weight of wanting something she had decided she was not allowed to want. He had let her carry both of those things alone for 4 years. He was done letting that stand. He called Sandra and told her to push his morning clear. Sandra asked no questions, which meant she already knew. He spent an hour on the phone with his lawyer, not about the partnership restructure, but about something more immediate, a board notification, an official announcement, the kind of thing that required signatures and preparation and would not be undone quietly once it was done. His lawyer said it was unusual to move this fast. Ryan said most things worth doing were. Then he called his head of communications and told her he needed the full leadership team and senior staff assembled in the main conference room at 2 o'clock. She asked what the agenda was. He said she'd find out at 2. Emily spent the morning working. She answered emails, prepared the Morrison account review, forwarded 3 items to Sandra, with transition notes already attached. She was systematic about it, thorough, in the way she was thorough about everything. And she did not let herself feel what it felt like to be closing a 4-year Chapter 1 file at a time. She had made the decision with her eyes open. She was going to execute it the same way. When the calendar invite for the 2 o'clock appeared on her screen with Ryan's name as organizer and the entire senior leadership listed as attendees, she assumed it was a quarterly operational review she hadn't been notified about. She added it to her afternoon without thinking twice. The conference room was full when she arrived. Not unusually full. She had coordinated larger gatherings, but the composition of it was different from a standard operational meeting. Department heads, senior managers, the board liaison who only appeared for formal occasions. People whose presence together in one room typically signaled that something had already been decided and was about to be announced. Emily took her usual seat near the end of the table, opened her laptop, and waited for Ryan to begin. He came in last, which he rarely did, and stood at the head of the table without sitting, without opening a folder, without the prepared talking points he almost always carried. The room adjusted to that. People who worked for Ryan Walker knew the difference between a meeting and a moment. He began by saying that Walker Global had a structural problem he had been negligent in addressing. He said it without preamble, which immediately had the room's complete attention. He said that for 4 years, the strategy behind some of the company's most consequential decisions, the Hargrove account, the Northeast restructure, the competitive positioning that had protected their market share through the last 2 fiscal years, had been developed, refined, and executed in significant part by one person, and that person did not hold a title that reflected that reality. He said that was his failure, not hers, and he was correcting it today. He said Emily Carter was being appointed executive partner of Walker Global, effective immediately with full equity rights and board representation commensurate with that role. Then he looked directly at her across the length of the conference table and said her name as if it were the most important word in the sentence. The room was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortably, but the way rooms go quiet when something has just been said, that reorders what everyone thought they understood. Emily felt the attention of the room shift to her and did not move. She was aware of her heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. She kept her expression neutral because it was the only thing she knew how to do with certainty in that moment. Ryan was still looking at her. He said, and this time his voice was different, stripped of the register he used in formal settings, carrying something underneath it she had never heard before, that he should have said this somewhere that wasn't a conference room, and he knew that. But he needed her to know that this was not a retention offer. It was not a response to Pinnacle strategies. It was something that had been true for a long time and should have been made visible long before he came close to losing her. He did not say he loved her in that room in front of 60 people. He was not that man, and she would not have wanted him to be. But he said enough. He said that the company she was thinking about leaving was as much hers as his, and that the person she thought was invisible had been to him the most indispensable presence in that building for 4 years. He said he understood if she still chose to go. He said he hoped she wouldn't. Emily looked at him across the table for a long time. Then she closed her laptop. She did not sign with Pinnacle Strategies. She did not submit the resignation. Over the following days, the paperwork for the executive partnership moved through legal with the efficiency of something that had already been decided, and Emily signed each document with the same fullness of name she had used on the resignation letter, Emily R. Carter, because this time the formality meant something different. Her nameplate changed. Her title changed. The way people in the building looked at her did not change dramatically, because the people who had worked alongside her had always known what she was. But the structure around her shifted, and that shift had weight. It was the kind of weight that a person who has been carrying too little of it for too long learns to recognize immediately. Ryan came to her office on the Friday of that week, at the end of the day, after everyone else had gone. He knocked 2 raps, same as always. She said, "Come in." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair he had sat in twice before once, when she had dismissed him in 4 sentences and gone back to her screen, and once when she had told him she was tired of being invisible. The chair had held a lot of conversations that mattered. He said he owed her more than what he'd said in a conference room in front of 60 people. Emily said she knew. He told her that the night at the restaurant when he'd walked across the room without deciding to, that was the first honest thing he'd done in a long time. That the anger he'd felt watching Derek Sloan speak to her the way he had wasn't protective instinct. It wasn't professional concern. It was the specific, unmanageable fury of a man who has just realized that the person he cares most about in the world is being treated as though she is small and cannot stand it. He said he had spent the weeks after that night finding ways to not say this directly, and he was done doing that. Emily looked at him steadily. She said she was done being small. He said he knew. He said that was never what she was to him, and that he had done a poor job of making that legible, and he intended to do better. She said that was a reasonable place to start. He said he could work with reasonable. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, loud, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by what happened in the offices stacked above it. And in the room on the 48th floor, 2 people sat with the particular quiet of a thing that has finally been named, not resolved entirely, not without the work that would take time and the adjustments neither of them had a template for, but named and therefore real in a way it hadn't been before. Ryan Walker, who had spent 6 years keeping everything at a clean professional distance, and Emily Carter, who had spent 4 years making herself useful and unobtrusive and quietly essential, looked at each other across a desk that had once held a resignation letter and began.